You know what's wild? Yale just announced they're making college completely free for families earning under $100,000 per year, and that covers nearly half of American households with school-age kids. This isn't just another financial aid program. It's potentially reshaping who gets access to elite education.
That's such a significant shift in how these institutions approach accessibility. What really stands out to me is the scale of this change. We're talking about covering costs that exceed $90,000 per year.
Well, what's fascinating is how this fits into Yale's longer history with financial aid. They've been doing need-blind admissions since the 1960s, but this takes it to a completely different level. They're not just considering students regardless of ability to pay, they're actively removing the financial barrier altogether.
So what happens to students from families making just over these thresholds? Like those right at the $200,000 mark?
That's actually a really important question. From what I understand, Yale already has this pretty robust sliding scale system in place. Right now, about 56% of their undergraduate class receives some form of need-based aid, and the average grant is actually more than the annual tuition cost.
That's remarkable when you think about the actual numbers involved. And they're not just covering the obvious expenses, right?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. Their financial aid director, Kari DeFonso, mentioned they provide these additional grants for things you might not even think about. Winter clothing, summer study, abroad opportunities, even emergency funds for unexpected hardships.
Well, that really speaks to understanding the full scope of what it means to attend college. It's not just about covering tuition and room and board.
And here's what I find particularly fascinating. Yale isn't doing this in isolation. Harvard, Penn, MIT, they're all making similar moves. It's like we're watching this domino effect among elite institutions, each one trying to outdo the other in terms of accessibility.
Though I wonder about the broader implications for higher education. Not every school has Yale's resources or endowment.
That's true, and it brings up this really interesting tension. On one hand, these elite institutions are setting this incredible example of what's possible. But on the other hand, they represent such a small percentage of college students nationwide.
Looking at the bigger picture, how do you think this might change the makeup of Yale's student body?
Well, that's where this gets really exciting. When you remove financial barriers, you're not just changing who can afford to attend. You're changing who even considers applying. Think about talented students from middle-class families who might have previously ruled out Yale without even trying.
That makes me think about the psychological impact of these announcements. It's almost like they're sending a signal that says, yes, this is actually possible for you.
Exactly. And you know what's particularly striking? The timing of this announcement coincides with this broader national conversation about student debt and educational access. It's like Yale is saying, we hear these concerns, and we're going to do something concrete about it.
That's a good point about the timing. How do you see this playing out in terms of actual enrollment changes?
Well, based on their current numbers, they already have about 1,000 students qualifying for no-cost degrees. But what's really interesting is how this could reshape their applicant pool. When you consider that families making up to $200,000 can now get free tuition, we're talking about opening doors for a huge segment of the American middle class.
The ripple effects could be pretty significant for the whole higher education landscape.
Absolutely right. And here's another fascinating aspect. Yale's provost, Scott Strobel, emphasized how this isn't just about charity or accessibility. It's about enriching the entire campus community by bringing in talented students from all backgrounds who might not have otherwise been able to attend.
That really frames it as an investment rather than just financial aid.
And that's exactly what makes this so powerful. They're essentially saying that economic diversity isn't just good for the students receiving aid, it's good for everyone. It creates this richer learning environment where students are exposed to different perspectives and experiences.
Though I can't help but think about how this might affect other universities that might feel pressure to follow suit but don't have the resources.
That's a crucial point. We might be seeing the beginning of a wider divide in higher education between the handful of wealthy institutions that can afford these kinds of programs and the vast majority that can't. It's almost like a tale of two educational systems.
So what do you think the long-term implications might be?
Well, I think we're going to see this play out in a few different ways. First, these elite institutions might become more economically diverse, which is great. But it could also increase the competition for spots at these schools, potentially making them even more selective in other ways.
That's an interesting perspective, making them more accessible financially, but potentially more competitive academically.
And here's what I think is really going to be fascinating to watch: how this might influence public policy around higher education. When private institutions start making these bold moves, it puts pressure on state governments and public universities to think differently about their own approaches to affordability.
It really does feel like we're at a turning point in how we think about funding higher education.
You know what's particularly striking? When you look at Yale's statement about this being central to their mission, it's not just about individual students' success. It's about how these students go on to serve their communities after graduation. They're thinking about the long-term societal impact.
That really brings it full circle, from individual opportunity to broader social change.
And maybe that's the real story here. It's not just about making Yale more affordable. It's about reimagining what role these elite institutions should play in creating a more equitable society. Whether other schools can follow suit or not, they're setting a new standard for what's possible.